Wow, yesterday's episode was upsetting, wasn't it? Jeez. So today we meet Mr. John Park Finley, an American meteorologist and Army Signal Service officer who went on to be the first person to actually take tornadoes seriously. Hi, I'm Chris May, host of This Day in Weather History, the podcast of the Weather Network in Canada. He was curious, he was a pioneer, and he was the first person to truly study tornadoes. Then in 1884, he published his research in the journal Science. But as they say, every dog has its day. And March 10th of 1884 was his. This day in weather history. Finley was a busy student and hungry to figure out this atmospheric anomaly. The best way to start was by looking into those that had already happened. He dove into any and all previous analysis available on just what was happening in the atmosphere at the time of previous tornadoes. Finley would go on to write the first known book on the subject of tornadoes, as well as many other manuals and booklets. He collected as much climatological data as was available and set up networks to be able to always have a stream available to him for further study, observation, and analysis. For this, he actually had to set up a nationwide weather observer network. He started one of the first private weather enterprises and opened an early aviation weather school. He could now add educator and motivator to his resume. But then, March 10th of 1884 happened. This event happened during what was the beginning of experimental tornado predictions on March 10th, this day in weather history. John Finley made these predictions based on the weather map that started at 7 o'clock in the morning Eastern and covered an 8-hour period up to 3 p.m. Then his second recorded prediction was made after a study of the afternoon weather maps that started at that 3 p.m. and picked up the next 8 hours until 11 p.m. This is already sounding like a day at the Weather Network in Canada when taking in and analyzing satellite model data from which to extrapolate and disseminate enough raw information from to formulate a forecast, or, in the case of this story, a prediction. But they're pretty much the same thing. During March and part of April, predictions, forecasts, were made twice daily, but for the remainder of April and for May and June, Finley made only one a day, and that covered a 16-hour period until 11 p.m. And from this, he was able to derive conclusions. Remember that This Day in Weather History can be enjoyed a number of ways. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider. But there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective, and oftentimes they will include visuals from that day's event from when it happened in weather history. So after listening to the full story here, go check out the podcast video short there on television or online at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. From his observations of weather maps and derived conclusions, Finley could conclude some very interesting and important findings regarding tornadoes. Now, I don't do this often unless it warrants it, but the following are direct quotes taken from his findings. These are quotes. 1. There was a definite relation between the position of tornado regions and the region of high contrast in temperature, the former lying to the south and east. 2. There was a similar definite relation of position of tornado regions and the region of high contrast in dew point, the former being, as before, to the south and the east. 3. The position of tornado regions is to the south and east of the region of high contrast of cool northerly and warm southerly winds, a rule that seems to follow from the preceding and is of use when observations of temperature and dew point are not accessible. 4. The relation of tornado regions to the movement of upper and lower clouds has been studied, and good results are still being hoped for. And 5. The study of the relation of tornado regions to the form of barometric depressions seems to show that tornadoes are more frequent when the major axis of the barometric trough trends to the north and south, or northeast and southwest, than when it trends due east and west. End quote. John Park Finley was an American meteorologist and Army Signal Service officer who went on to be the first person to actually and thankfully take tornadoes seriously. This day in weather history. Tomorrow is March 11th, and we will go back to a force of nature that was so powerful and so stunning and shocking in its scope that the likes of which had not been seen since, well, to be honest with you, February 28th of the previous year. That was the great Chile earthquake and tsunami of 2010, which I've covered here on this podcast. Tomorrow marks the anniversary of the massive Japan earthquake and Sendai tsunami that took out the Daiichi nuclear power plant and put the entire planet Earth on red alert. On this day in weather history, tomorrow with me, your host, Chris May.